Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 39 of the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. I hope you're doing well. I'm just sitting by my window enjoying the sunshine, and I wrapped up a wonderful conversation with my guest today, Theodora Wildcroft, who's the author of Post-Lineage Yoga, Guru to #MeToo. Theo is a yoga teacher trainer, a writer, a scholar, and who's doing innovative research in the democratization of post-lineage yoga and the evolving practice of teaching yoga for community health. She's also the author of this new book, as well as a visiting fellow at the Open University and a project coordinator at the SOAS Center for Yoga Studies in the UK. This conversation of post-lineage yoga has always been something that's piqued my interest. I've personally been part of Lineages when I lived in India. I've seen the beautiful side of it as well as the very ugly side of Lineages. So it was really fascinating for me to get this conversation going with Theo. Theo, being a researcher, has an approach, a structure, and a way of communicating which is just refreshing. I definitely think we need to make more space for high-quality research in the yoga world. A lot of researchers are already doing this work. We just need to bring it into mainstream focus and conversations. And because we will benefit as yoga teachers, and you'll hear me say this in the episode as well, sometimes we're so close to yoga, to our own interpretation of yoga, that we can be rather close-minded, or we look for people who want to be in our own echo chambers. So having conversations like this with researchers who really put in almost years, if not a lifetime of effort in doing this is really valuable. In today's conversation, we chat about what is post-lineage yoga, the difference between styles of yoga and lineages, and how to identify whether you belong or you're practicing in a lineage or you're in a style of yoga, what it means to have a reformist attitude, how not to cause more harm. We talk about, are women more susceptible to leaning towards post-lineage yoga and why that is? What's the future? Okay, what that entails. How do standardizations play into all of this? The key role of social media. Is cancel culture the only way of accountability? And then, yes, we get into what the future holds and how accountability is a big part of that conversation. There's just so much we get into. I'm really excited for you to listen to this one. But before we get to the show, please remember there are many ways to support this podcast: reviews, rating, and subscribing to the podcast. So every time a new episode drops, you instantly get notified and it becomes a part of your weekly ritual. And I'm hoping it becomes part of your weekly ritual is one way of supporting the podcast. You can also get some really good content and interesting conversations by getting on my email list. I also have a pranayama training and immersion that's coming up, which you'll hear me talk about on the newsletter. So just make sure you find the links in the description of this podcast episode, and I would love to connect with you on email. And lastly, if you want some support, community, and mentorship, then join my online monthly mentorship club called the Mindful Yoga Teachers Club. Okay, I think there was a lot of club in that last sentence, but this is available to any yoga teacher. It's just $17 a month. It's also a great way of supporting the podcast. Sometimes I get asked by listeners like you as to how you can support the podcast by signing up for the Mindful Yoga Teachers Club. That's a great way to support the work that we're doing with this podcast. Okay. Links to everything is in the show notes. You can also find me on Instagram or Facebook, and I'm happy to share these links with you. Now, here's Theodora Wildcroft talking about all things post-lineage yoga. Hi, my name is Arundhati, and you're listening to the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. I'm an ex-Bollywood dancer turned yoga and wellness educator. I've built a 6-figure business as an immigrant, woman of color yoga teacher with no business background, no handstands, pure instinct, and the free information found on Google. If you love doing yoga and you dream of teaching it someday, this podcast is for you. We go over everything from doing and teaching yoga to scaling a small business, living a modern yoga lifestyle, and so much more. You'll find interesting, fun, raw conversations along with some tips, tricks, strategies, and insights in this podcast. So grab your cup of chai and let's jump in. Hi, Theo. Welcome to the show.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me. It's really lovely to be here.
I've been looking forward to talking to you. I remember very clearly how I came across your book, Post-Lineage Yoga. It was on Instagram and someone had shared a screenshot of them holding your book. And I was like, wait a minute, I have to read that because it's a topic that's been on my mind. I've heard it being used in the yoga world, but nobody was really speaking to it at volume and in depth like you have. So I was really excited. I feel like there is such a need for researchers like you to be in the yoga world, because for me or yoga teachers in general, we're sometimes or often so attached to our yoga, even with the best intentions, that we may not see things as objectively. So my question here is, what made you feel so strongly about post-lineage yoga that made you write a book on it?
Well, it's interesting because I'm not sure how much objectivity was involved, because I started as a yoga teacher really, but that's not how the book began. I was just so aware of all the debates happening that seemed to be pitting two things, one against the other. And one thing is kind of traditional yoga, and traditional yoga was defined as always, if possible, taking place in India, being like a well-known, not just a lineage, but like a well-known lineage with a brand, probably with a trademark, like one of the big names, that it was taught in a certain way, that it had quite a kind of static kind of set of asana plus pranayama plus meditation, kind of probably in that order, etc. And that was on the one hand. That was traditional yoga, and that was the good yoga. And on the other hand was the bad yoga, and the bad yoga was commercial yoga that was all about just jumping up and down, hot vinyasa flow that had no reference to any of the tradition of yoga at all, or any awareness of South Asian cultures, let alone Indian cultures, let alone Hindu cultures. Or Hinduism, and that's the bad yoga, and everyone over there is making money, and then the traditional yoga is the good yoga, and that's the style we should be doing. And it seemed like such a simplified debate, like an overly simplified debate, and I wasn't really sure that I saw myself or any of the yoga that my friends were doing in either of those pictures. Like there was a lot of other things going on. So I have friends who are teaching in, tiny little village halls and things, but what they're teaching isn't necessarily part of a big named lineage, right? So they're doing that. And also, I have friends who are kind of have South Asian heritage of one form or another. And that kind of blend of kind of a bit of yoga, a bit of Ayurveda, a bit of this, that, and the other that you just kind of learn growing up, that isn't really part of a lineage, but there's this kind of heritage of all these different bits and pieces of things. So there's that as well. So there were all these different kinds of yoga, kirtan and all these other things that didn't fit in this picture. And I was like, so, how do we find ourselves within this debate? And there also seemed to be a lot of overlap. Like there's a lot of those big lineages that seem to be quite good at branding themselves and earning a lot of money as well. So I thought that was interesting. And I was like, what I really wanted to get to was I wanted to get to what's often called lived experience or lived religion. Like, what are people actually doing? What's actually happening? And that's always where I start. So the research project was, let's go and talk to some of these yoga teachers that have kind of long careers, or, people from within the community that may not consider themselves yoga teachers, but they might lead kirtan or whatever else it might be. And let's talk to them about the much more complex picture of what heritage and lineage and boundaries of tradition and religion look like for them. And I needed to come up with a label for that, because that's the academic thing, right? You have to kind of call it a thing, and then you can define a thing. And then when you've got that definition, then people can think about how much they see themselves in that picture or not. Because if you don't see yourself in that picture, that's absolutely fine, right? But you need the picture, you need the definition to begin with. And my supervisors for my PhD were saying things like, well, is it anti-lineage? And I was going, it's definitely not anti-lineage. There are definitely people there who have quite strong connections to their lineages and of origin soon, still. And they were saying, well, what is it then? And I came up with this term, post-lineage yoga, which isn't about lineage isn't important anymore. And one of the ways I define it is that it's that moment in a long-term practitioner's life when the tradition of yoga as they were first taught it isn't enough on its own. It's not that you reject it, it's not that you don't want to do it anymore, but you start to look beyond that for your sense of authenticity and authority. And that's a really delicate and difficult thing to do, right? So how is that done? So that's post-lineage yoga. It's very much in dialogue with different kinds of tradition and different forms of lineage and different forms of authority, rather than a rejection of it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I really like how you defined post-lineage yoga, because as you were saying that, I was like, yeah, that is in a large part my own experience, because I have personally been in lineages and I have loved it for a certain amount of time. And at the same time, I have run away from lineages and I put myself in this post-lineage bracket. But you're so right. It's been an oversimplified debate about good versus bad yoga. But I want to bring in styles of yoga here, because a question I've often gotten is, people have outright asked me, what is a lineage? Sometimes I think, it's everybody knows what a yoga lineage is, but not everyone out there knows what qualifies to become a lineage. So would you be able to just talk a little more about what is a lineage and how do these styles or schools of yoga that have existed, is there a difference, and how do we know whether we're in a lineage or practicing a style of yoga?
Well, I think that's a really important question. And as ever, the answer is going to be, it's a little bit complicated, but I think you've hit on the really important question. Before I answer it, I just want to point out that my kind of academic background is basically anthropology. So I think sometimes people get confused. What we're doing as anthropologists is we're trying to describe things, we're trying to reflect back to the community how it sees itself, right? So it is not my job to kind of define a lineage, but I can tell you how lineages tend to define themselves. And I think that's an important difference, right?
Okay.
So I think that what you see when people use the word lineage is something that's actually quite confused and quite blurred in many ways. So there's an ideal and there's an actuality. And the ideal of lineage is kind of predicated on this guru shishya idea, where you have a single teacher and they have a collection of students, and each one of those is in kind of, not in subservience, but like is in at least in a position of deference to the teacher. Like the teacher is the one who has the knowledge, and you go to them and you are in a position of deference towards your teacher. And then each of those students then has their own students, and so on and so forth. And the question always is, well, at what point are you allowed to innovate and change, and how much are you allowed to innovate and change? Because if the teachings come to you and then you pass them on, how much innovation is allowed to happen at that point? And that is something that lineages debate all the time. So it's not as simple as teacher-student to, and then the student becomes a teacher, and so on and so on and so forth, right? Because you can somehow get so far from the teachings as they were given to you that you are somehow no longer considered to be within that lineage. So therefore, it's something else, right? It's not just about the method of transmission or transference. It's also about a certain way of doing things. So then you have the concept of style, a style of yoga, and that's where that overlaps, right? So a style of yoga is a particular way of doing things, a particular repertoire of and a particular idea about what practice looks like. Okay. And that can also have kind of fuzzy boundaries because that changes over time as well, right? That evolves as according to new information. So you have styles of yoga and you have which might define the repertoire. And then you have lineages which might define the method of transmission, but neither of them are quite what we're talking about either. So then you have to add on to this issues of business, which are around brand and even family business. So this is another interesting thing, right? So what you get in some of the big major lineages is you get this thing whereby the authority passes through families, which is a fascinating thing, right? Because
like Iyengar yoga.
Yeah. So then it's like it's a family business, but it's also a lineage because the idea is this their child or their grandchildren have been brought up with these teachings and therefore they would be the most dedicated students. But are they, right? So this is all these different definitions. And then you get, like I say, you get the brand idea or the business idea, which is that there is actually a massive difference between a pre-modern yoga environment in which a teacher might have a few handfuls of disciples, or maybe part of a big ashram system as well. But that is very different to what Iyengar or Shivananda or Pattabhi Jois are doing when they have to move within the modern world, that all of a sudden you get you're going to copyright implications, you get brandings, you get systematized teacher trainings, you get almost a franchising that happens, right? Where things become standardized so that they can be done by lots of different people, so that not everyone who becomes an Iyengar yoga teacher can count BKS Iyengar or even Gita Iyengar or anyone else as their only teacher, right? It's this stuff gets so these three kind of ideas: brands, lineages, and kind of these family networks. These different ideas, and style, right? They all cover slightly different things. And all of them come together to kind of influence the way we think about the kind of yoga that we do. And there's a lot of debate and a lot of boundary disputes around the fuzzy edges in this stuff.
Mm-hmm. That brings a lot of clarity, just how you explain that. Would you say, am I right in understanding that lineages can also be loosely referred to as styles of yoga by someone who's not getting deeply into this conversation?
Oh, I think so. I think your casual practitioner who may just kind of pop along to the local yoga class, they're picking, if you're going to a new yoga class in town, whether it's in a big studio or whether it is in your village hall or your community center, wherever else it might be, that you're understandably not doing massively deep research into the teachers involved. Therefore you're picking according to the names of the yoga because it's a kind of yoga that you recognize, right? So then it is more of a style. So you're picking Iyengar yoga because you've done something that someone called Iyengar yoga before and it worked for you and it felt good. Or that Ashtanga is the one where you kind of move around a lot and maybe you don't want to do that one, or if in doubt, it's Hatha yoga, and then you never know what you're going to get, right? So.
Yeah. So true. So true. Your tagline for the book is Guru to #MeToo. In your research, do you think women are leaning more towards post-lineage yoga because in many ways, we want to break free of the patriarchal system?
I think there's a definite tendency towards that. I also think that there's also a tendency the other way, and that there's a lovely line that I'm going to misquote by Ellen Sixu, who's one of my favorite theorists, and she talks more generally about religion, and she talks about there's always another god waiting around the corner with their reassuring smile of an enigma personified, and there's this idea that I think Sixu talks about and Irigaray talks about, which is kind of quite like there are other issues with their work because they can be very essentializing about different cultural movements. But they do talk about the ways in which sometimes you look to cultural systems outside of your native systems in order to find the freedom there. And it feels like there's a kind of freedom there, and yet the deeper you get into it, the more you realize that actually it's the patriarchy all over again, right? So the idea that kind of guru systems could somehow be an escape for the patriarchy, I think might make a lot of Indian women smile. So that's a very idea, right? It's like these. So we're all, I think as women, if we're interested in spiritual projects of different kinds and interested in that kind of religious freedom, it is one of the ways that we look for freedom, right? Is we look for the thing that's not the culture that we were brought up in, because of the associations that we have with that. So an interesting example of this, I think, is anecdotal. That I don't think there's any formal research on this yet, but I think anecdotally we're aware that in the UK that there are a number of kind of diasporic South Asian origin women in particular that are kind of going to some of those movements like ISKCON, some of the white led, if you like, kind of Bhakti movements, because they feel less patriarchal and yet still a connection to the Hinduism that they grew up with. So it's kind of, there's interesting dynamics going on there about different ways of doing things, because they are movements often in which women are allowed to be pujaris or are allowed to do rituals in ways that maybe weren't allowed in the home in different ways. But of course, all this stuff is very, very diverse. We can talk about these things in generalization, but in reality,
it's different. Yeah.
Everyone finds really individual ways of working through this stuff, I think.
So true. And when I was reading your book, you've done a great job of really, I mean, you're a researcher, so it probably comes naturally to you, but it was so structured. And I loved reading, you were observing people's practices. You went into yoga festivals. And when I opened your book, I was like, I had no idea what to expect. I just got excited and I ordered it. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to read this. And until you mentioned it in the book about how practitioners at yoga festivals are different from mainstream yoga, and you've said it better than I am right now, but it was really unique and it jumped out at me. And after you said it, I'm like, yes, I have seen it all the time in yoga festivals. So why, for someone who's listening who hasn't read your book yet, what's so unique about yoga festivals, and is there a particular reason why you went in that direction for your research?
Well, I'll start with the second question. The reason why I started is because I was spending a lot of time in those spaces, and they were completely hidden within mainstream perceptions and also scholarly perceptions of what yoga is. Like, that stuff was not involved. In fact, I was reading all of these academic accounts of contemporary yoga, saying contemporary yoga, Anglophone yoga in particular, the yoga of kind of Europe and America and Australia. And they were saying there's no devotional elements. There's none of this. And I was looking around at people doing, 5 a.m. Havans in fields outside Glastonbury, going, what do you mean there's no devotional elements, and the kirtan's going on till past midnight, and it's like, this is ridiculous. And also no concept of seva as well. And it was like, these things only function through seva. It's only because of the service that people are offering and the volunteering that's going on that allows it to happen. So I think that there's a particular combination of things that happens in those festival environments, partly because they're community semi-autonomous spaces. So in a festival environment, a small festival environment in particular, rather than a big festival. In a big festival, I think you get a separation between kind of the people running it and the kind of consumers, right? In a small festival environment, that's really blurred. So like, everyone tends to be doing a little bit of some form of service, right, as part of being there. And everyone's kind of, there's more of people cooking together, eating together, figuring out how to put the compost toilets together, all these kinds of things. So these are pragmatic environments in which people are building community together. And that's very different from a commercial environment in which you turn up and you pay for a product, right? So I think it's a more holistic environment in that really grounded sense of holistic, as in, you want a shower, then you have to make sure the fire is fed, right? And that feels I guess that feels quite, I'm going to use the word yogic, which I know is a really problematic because there's so many different definitions of that word, right? But that feels like a lot of those teachings of yoga talk about, like, can you, and the Buddhist teachings as well, it's all about chopping wood and carrying water, right? You've got to do the thing. But they're also very fluid environments, in that things tend to be a bit, and I would talk about this as a lot in the book. There's a lot of fluidity in those environments because the schedules slip and you're never quite sure what's going to happen, and you can't quite figure out from the description what's going to happen in a particular session. They're not, and nobody's earning any money, and the person who is in the class as a student and the 9 a.m. class is teaching the session at 11, and there's less of that formalized, standardized kind of situation that you get in kind of commercial spaces, which have to be that way, because if you're going to pay your however many pounds or whatever it is that you're handing over at a fairly high-end yoga studio for a session of hot vinyasa flow, like that's what you're going to get, right? You've got to know that that's what's going to arrive, and it's got to start on time and it's got to finish on time because you've got to get out to get the kids or so on. So they're very different environments. But I think some elements of those environments is also true in a lot of other of what you might call pragmatic environments. So I think that the kind of yoga that happens sometimes that happens in, say, schools and prisons, and a lot of those kind of more service-oriented environments that yoga teachers sometimes work in, I think they're also pragmatic in different ways. You kind of have to negotiate, and it's not a product that's being sold in the same way. So I think there are other pragmatic environments, but festival environments are particularly unusual, I think.
And you're absolutely right. I was making a list of things that you were saying, and I literally made like a festival versus conference note here. And I could click, because I've been at festivals, I've been at conferences, but I've never really thought it through as to the differences and the different types of people in attendance. It almost feels like a festival has some semblance of how you would live in an ashram, where you have duties and you have to pay for your boarding quite literally with your service. And
yes,
it just reminds me of that.
Oh yeah, completely. And that because you see who ends up working the kitchens, who ends up running the kitchens at the yoga camps and festivals, and it's all people who've been at ashrams or are gurdwaras as well. They know
yes.
they know how to feed 200 people with some lentils and some rice, and they know how to organize some slightly flaky volunteers who turn up half an hour late, a bit spaced out because they've been in the sauna and, whatever else. So yeah, very much so. I think there's a big overlap in those kinds of environments.
You mentioned, just as you were speaking, you spoke about standardization. What's your take on standardization of yoga, and how does that impact post-lineage work?
Oh, it's huge. Okay, so this is where kind of the kind of academic background, if you like, comes in, which is like my master's degree and kind of where I come up through the kind of theory that I bring into this is all community learning. So there's an actual body of work about how you learn in informal environments, so how youth work works, how community development works, and those kinds of things. A lot of it based in the global south and similar spaces. A lot of the pragmatic work comes out of those spaces for understanding how people actually learn when they're not in formal environments, and how communities share and evolve knowledge. And you can you can share knowledge in standardized ways. And that's a way of working that feels really familiar to us, because most of us have been in some form of school system which works that way, right? But actually, that's not how communities learn, and that's not how communities evolve. They evolve through things called communities of practice. So there's work by someone called Etienne Wenger who did the first work on this. So in order for communities of practice to really work, it looks pretty chaotic. Like the more boundaries, the more, it's not so much the boundaries. Like there has to be boundaries. There has to be boundaries. Everyone has to know what's going on. There has to be a shared aim and a kind of shared set of values to make it happen. But if there's too much standardization, then the evolution doesn't happen. The change doesn't happen. So I have a little game that I play when I'm teaching people about post-lineage yoga, because I drop into teacher trainings and things, and I have a little game that I play whereby we do what's sometimes known as the whispers game, where you give one person a sentence or a piece of knowledge and then they pass it on to the next person, and so on and so on and so on. Right? Now, if your aim is for that knowledge to be unchanged, then that's one way of working, right? And if you think about transferring the Vedas across however many thousands of years of history, right? In some ways you want as little evolution as possible, right? You want because you don't want to lose that incredibly important body of knowledge. So part of what we're doing is we need to think about the intentions of what we're doing, because if what we're doing is moving profound spiritual religious knowledge through time, then yes, everyone just has to do as far as possible what the person before them did. It needs to be as standardized as possible. But if we're talking about community health, if we're talking about well-being, if we're talking about all these other intentions that have been attached to yoga over the years, then we need a different way of working, because it's a way of working that needs to diversify and that needs to evolve with the latest research understandings about how joints move or whatever else it might be. So all of a sudden, it's kind of almost, it's a disservice to the work of somebody like BKS Iyengar not to update it with the latest scientific research. Why would you do that? Just, because Iyengar wrote in 1963, like that knowledge needs to be updated across time, right? So therefore it can't be standardized in the same way. So therefore there needs to be as much evolution as possible. The difficult bit comes is when people confuse standardization for standards. I think because we've been so indoctrinated by school systems, we think that quality comes from standardization. And time again, we see that not to be the case, particularly with something as broad and as multifaceted and as diverse and as beautiful, to be frank, as something like yoga.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
You kill it, right?
Yeah. And I was just thinking in the back of my head, there's so much, uproar about Yoga Alliance standards and how they don't work. And at the same time, if you take those out, you will have people who are certified yoga teachers over 5 hours or 10 hours or over the weekend. So it makes full sense. But in some way, Theo, I'm thinking these standardizations have existed very informally in all these systems over the years. I thought of it when you said you were talking about the Vedas. Just each lineage has figured out its own way of passing things on. And very loosely, I'm thinking that was their way of standardizing how this oral tradition came down. I don't think there's a question there, but just something that popped into my head.
I think it's important. Yeah. And I think it's important. The reason why I like to play that game with the teachers when I'm training is because I think we want to really value that. What I'm not saying is that, we shouldn't do it that way. I'm saying that we need to be thinking about what it is we're trying to do so that we adapt the pedagogy to the intention, right? So we adapt the techniques to what we're trying to do. Because if you're it's slightly embarrassing, even though he's not here, my husband's has sung the Hanuman Chalisa every day since lockdown began back in March, because that makes him happy. And if you're going to learn, I have not learned Hanuman Chalisa. I'm not a good enough Bhakti yogi to do that, but he has. If you're going to do that, like, you have to learn the words as they are. You have to learn the tune as it has been given to you, right? Then you might over time, you might slightly adapt the tune. You might transpose it from the harmonium to the guitar or whatever else it might be. But there has to be a weight of repetition there, because that's what he's trying to do. If, on the other hand, I have a Pavana Muktasana series, a series of joint freeing movements that I think are useful for people to do to keep them healthy, because, moving your joints every day might be considered to be a good thing to do. And in front of me, right, there's a good thing, is that in front of me are 5 different people, and one of them's in a wheelchair, and one of them only has one arm, and one of them doesn't speak English as their first language, or, I'm going to have to adapt that. That's because it's a different thing. So it's I think what we haven't done, which is really interesting to me, is we've considered a lot about the practice, but not so much about the pedagogy. And just as yoga as a practice can be really diverse, I think our pedagogies should be equally diverse.
Absolutely. And I feel like we have to learn how to strike a balance where we don't cause harm. And I'm not saying this is anything to do with your book. I'm just sharing a thought of that's been in my head, where we don't harm the yoga, but we also maintain a reformist attitude, because of course times have changed and how we live has changed. And especially I feel like it's so easy for people to just sell their own interpretations of yoga, and that has, we've seen it, right? I don't even need to tell you how much harm that has caused. So how, and maybe you'll have some insight for this, how can we strike a balance where we have a reformist attitude and we don't harm the yoga? I know it's probably a very heavy question.
It's really hard. It is a heavy question, because unfortunately there's a simple answer, and the simple answer is, we need to dismantle cultural imperialism, undo colonialism, and like that's the simple answer, right? Like end racism and it'll all be fine. So we can but what can we actually do? What can we do as human beings? Might be a different answer. And I think that's where I really wanted the book to go, is that I really wanted to spend time with people who've been doing this for a long time, who've been trying to, on a kind of small level, like as individuals, they've been trying to teach. They weren't the most famous yoga teachers in the world. They were people who were trying to teach from a place of authenticity whilst balancing all of these different things, right? And it was like, if I take a few of these people and I really spend time with them, I'm not going to come up with the answer, but I can at least give you some kind of synthesis as to what they feel works for them, about the ways in which we balance different forms of authenticity. And I go into the book in some detail, and I do it in training as well. But one of the things that I think it's about how you balance different sources of authority. And that's how we balance them as individuals, ourselves, and how we balance them as communities and cultures, right? And the really simple version is it's about internal authority, expert authority, and peer authority. Right? And how we balance those three things. So it's not all about expertise. It's not all about saying, well, somebody wrote it in the year 1937 and therefore we have to keep doing it forever. Nor is it about saying, well, this scientist last year came up with this understanding and therefore we have to change everything, right? So it's how do we balance all of those different forms of expertise and external authority. How do we then balance that with what makes sense in our own practice, whether that practice is our own practice in our own personal practice or our own teaching practice? So how do we balance with that kind of checking in with yourself? And then how do we balance that with what you might call the peer authority, which is who are we checking in with? Right. So who and actually yoga teachers are trying to do this all the time. Unfortunately, most of the time they're trying to do it on social media, which is a terrible place to try and do it.
Absolutely.
People, it's just shocking. But there's people on Facebook groups everywhere going, how do I do this? How do I do that? Right. They're constantly trying to check in with other yoga teachers. So we need to find better ways of having good conversations together so that we can see if we can find a consensus. And as I say that, I know that the most important caveat to that is if your consensus is based on only one kind of yoga teacher who is, for example, American, white, middle-class, female, able-bodied, then you're going to get one type of answer. Right? So it's also about who are we including within those conversations? In order to balance all of those things. And are we able to have those difficult conversations, preferably away from Facebook, so we can have good conversations about it and find consensus? So what I say when I'm asked by people like Yoga Alliance or the British Wheel here in the UK, anytime I'm asked by yoga bureaucratic organizations what they can do to improve the standard of yoga teaching in all of these areas, I say the one thing you can do is make it easier and more possible for yoga teachers to have good conversations with other yoga teachers. That's the most important thing you can do.
So true. As you mentioned social media, I had written down two things I wanted to bring up. One of it, because you said, you were talking to not so-called famous yoga teachers. And I've always believed that just because someone is popular doesn't necessarily make them an authority on the subject or there are a lot of people who have studied a lot of yoga and a lot of other things. And just because they don't broadcast it on social media doesn't mean they have any less expertise. What's your, I think we got a glimpse into your take on social media, have these conversations off this platform. And I cannot agree more. I think it is so important. I keep saying you can't learn yoga from social media.
Oh God, yes.
And and there's so much debate, and each yoga teacher is trying to get one up on the other yoga teacher. And I sometimes just laugh about all of this, but cancel culture is also a very prevalent thing in the yoga world, especially with the use of social media. So I'm curious to get your take on maybe more social media, but also cancel culture. And in your own experience, is there a way we can handle this? Because there will be power abuses, there will be issues that will happen. Is cancel culture the only way out?
It's difficult. It's difficult because, okay, so when I think about cancel culture, what I think about is gossip. Because I think gossip is something that we've had for a lot longer than cancel culture. And I think cancel culture is in some ways it's the next evolution of gossip. And
it's fascinating.
Gossip is a really interesting thing because there's partly it's about the evolution of the word and what gossip was. And gossip is the rough justice that is the only recourse of the most marginalized.
Can you say that again?
That's the reality.
Can you say that again?
Yeah. So gossip is the rough justice that is the only recourse of the most marginalized. So gossip is what you use when you don't have any other power. Right? So if I think about gossip, I think about the networks of information that I might share with other young women when I was a young woman. And, you wouldn't you would say, oh, well, I'm going on a date with such and such a boy or whatever. And someone else would go, don't be alone with him. And you wouldn't even need to ask why, right? That there were things that happened. There were abuses of power that happened. And there were just people that you knew not to be alone with, not to be drunk with or whatever. And that information got shared kind of privately between young women because there was no official justice for any of that violence. And when I say rough justice, it's because it is, of course, completely open to abuse in and of itself, right? Because it's, if you get gossip about someone that it isn't true of, that can be a problem. There's no fairness in it, if you see what I mean. It is a rough kind of justice. And also, if you're not in the inner circle of the people that are sharing the gossip, you also don't get to find out. So the most marginalized people of all that aren't in these gossip networks don't get to find out. Now, we see this play out today. So when you have a yoga teacher that is accused of unethical behavior, sometimes it's very, very difficult to get any kind of proper justice and investigation into what's happened, right? So then people resort to the gossip, the cancel culture, the kind of the word being spread that this person's, career should be ended in one form or another. And that is not based on any weighing of evidence or proof, right? It's a rough form of justice. But also what then often happens with those yoga teachers, if they are indulging a lot of unethical behavior, is they simply move jurisdictions. So we see this. We see this where gurus and senior teachers of different kinds have been accused of abuse. They move to South America, or they move to South Asia, or they move to Japan.
Absolutely.
Or they move to Eastern Europe, where people aren't getting the access to that social media information because it's all in English. So it's the same problems. So I see cancel culture as being a very blunt instrument, and I think it's wielded very, in many ways badly. But I also think that it's a symptom of a lack of justice to begin with, right? That's the problem.
I really love your way of interpreting gossip. I asked you to repeat it because I was actually writing it down. The rough justice. It's fascinating to me. And I completely agree. Like, we don't have enough when issues happen, power abuses happen. And we've seen a lot of that. We don't have anything in the yoga world. We have it in all other streams. If you are a physical therapist, if you're a just anything, we have it. We just don't have any of that in yoga. But this is definitely this conversation, this tangent I went off on, I know is not directly related to your book, but it's also sometimes I've noticed cancel culture exists because of the way someone thinks. And just because one group doesn't agree with the other, and then there's this whole movement to cancel them. But I'm going to, sorry, go ahead.
I just was going to add that I think the main difference with social media is that social media weaponizes any kind of anger, any kind of, like, that's the whole point, right?
There's sensational content.
Yeah, because that's what it rewards. That's what Facebook, Twitter, so on and so forth. At the end of the day, their business model isn't based in us having nice conversations with people that we like. It's based in us getting so furious or so overexcited or so upset that we kind of keep sharing and stay on the platform. So I think people don't realize that that's entirely what I think what it is we don't realize how easily our emotions are manipulated in that sense. Okay? That's the problem.
Absolutely. I'm going to come back on track. Thank you for indulging me on that tangent. What's the future of post-lineage yoga?
I can tell you what the next challenge is, I think, because that's the most important thing, because things will evolve, and at some point the future of yoga will evolve to a point where someone else comes up with a better model for understanding it, and it will have a new name. Like this framework is only useful for as long as it's useful. It's a way of understanding things. It's a lens. But I can tell you what the next challenge is, and I think that over and again what I'm saying is the next challenge is actually accountability. So, and that speaks to everything we've been talking about, really, because we have a lot of statements around everything from cultural appropriation to guru abuse to Black Lives Matter to whatever. Like, we see a lot of statements. We see a lot of people saying we are listening and this is important. But what we haven't in any way cracked is the accountability. What actually happens? Like, for example, even with Yoga Alliance, people say, oh, Yoga Alliance want to be the yoga police. And I think that's really funny because it's the last thing they want to be. When you join Yoga Alliance, you sign up to all these statements of ethical behavior, this, and all of these behavioral commitments and all of your other commitments about what kind of curriculum you'll do. And there's all of this stuff that you sign up to. But who checks? And what happens if you fail any one of those commitments?
Pretty much nothing.
And that's where we're not sure. Yeah. And I think that's true in general. So where we're looking at yoga more and more as particularly because we're looking at yoga more and more as a practice that's being used for kind of supplementary health, and well-being, not just health. So we're looking at it as a well-being intervention that organizations like the NHS would love to recommend, for example, and schools want to use it because it helps overall well-being and so on. The more and more that happens, the more and more those external organizations are going, okay, but we need to know you're going to be safe. We need to know that you're safe to work with these people. And we have no way of guaranteeing that, because at the moment, other than a criminal investigation, there is nothing that stops you from being a yoga.
There's nothing in between.
There's nothing in between. And any of the possible solutions for what lies in between seem really unpalatable, because are we talking about national registers of yoga teachers that you could get struck off from? Because that feels really feels like somewhere I don't want to go. That feels really like that would involve standardization. And, how are you going to create that register? Are you going to put the kind of people who are doing dawn have-ans in fields outside Glastonbury, you're going to put them on a yoga teachers register? How do we have accountability when everyone thinks that this behavior should be policed, but no one agrees on who should do the policing?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So true. And it's a really difficult question.
And I don't know the answer. But I will, if I find someone who's come across the answer, that's my job, is I will see if there's someone who's come across the answer. And as soon as I find someone who has, I'll try and tell people about it, basically.
I have so much that I want to talk to you about. We didn't get into like power dynamics and
Oh,
the role of teachers and students and how we can empower each other, and how it's the vertical of the teacher knows everything was that the old way. But I want to be respectful of your time, Theo, and this has been fascinating. I thank you for writing that book. It was a delight to read, and I will make sure to link to the book where people can find you, your website, and all the wonderful work that you do. Thank you so much for being here.
thank you for having me. It's been a great conversation.
Thanks for tuning in. As always, your support for this podcast means a lot. Remember, the Mindful Yoga Teachers Club meets once a month, and you can get mentorship for just $17 a month. You can sign up anywhere you connect with us. We'd love to have you and have conversations about yoga, understand more about your yoga journey, help you grow a little more and have fun while doing it. A review, a rating, and subscribing and sharing this with your yoga friends would also be wonderful. I can't wait to see you next week. Well, in this case, I won't see you. I can't wait to connect with you next week. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.